So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to IEF's virtual Q&A session on collaring elephants for research, management, and conservation. My name is Chase Ledoux, IEF Special Projects Manager, and I'll be the moderator for the next 90 minutes. Joining in on the call from IEF is Deborah Olson, our Executive Director, and Sarah Conley, our Director of Conservation. So, as a reminder, this session is a follow-up to a workshop we hosted last month, which brought together more than 250 registrants from over 40 countries. We were sort of overwhelmed with the interest in the topic, and the questions that were submitted during that sessions were so numerous that we really couldn't come close to addressing them all in the hour we had scheduled. So today is our response to that demand, dedicated time to work through as many audience questions as we can in conversation with the same two panelists you heard from last month. We're so grateful that they've lent their time and expertise again to do this. If you attended last month's session, welcome back. But if you're joining for the first time, welcome. Today's session is structured entirely around the questions. So before we begin, let me introduce our two panelists from last time. Hadrien Haupt is a wildlife tracking specialist at Africa Wildlife Tracking based in South Africa, where he is involved in the design and manufacture of tracking equipment used by researchers, conservationists, and wildlife managers around the world. His background combines field guiding and wildlife monitoring with technical innovation. And then our other speaker is Dr. Aung Chan, who is the Asia Conservation Program Director at Denver Zoo Conservation Alliance, and he's a member of the IUCN Asian Elephant Specialist Group. His PhD work at Colorado State University included GPS collar deployments on wild Asian elephants in Myanmar, studying their movement patterns and habitat use at the human-wildlands interface. Great. So for those of you who weren't with us last month, I'm just going to provide a quick summary about the topics we discussed from each speaker. If you didn't look at them already, we sent out the materials, including the recording of last month's session, along with the slides and some unanswered questions from the live session that our speakers answered after the session. So Sarah will be dropping those in the chat so you can refer to them during the talk today if you would like. To start, Hadrien walked us through the technical foundation of elephant collaring, and he introduced us to the range of tracking technologies available and the differences between systems that determine how data moves between the collar and the researcher. He covered the sensors and settings that shape what you learn from a deployment, the fit and attachment options for elephants, the common mistakes teams make when specifying collars, and the animal welfare considerations that sit alongside every hardware decision. So some of you submitted questions related to those topics, and we'll get to those today, but that sort of forms the framework of what Hadrien presented. Aung then took us into the field research and conservation side of collaring, especially for an Asian context. Drawing on his work with wild Asian elephants in Myanmar, he covered what data cleaning and processing actually looks like, what you can learn from GPS data, and the kinds of research and management questions collars are well suited to answer. He spoke to the practicalities that rarely make it into published papers, such as permits and procedures across different countries, community engagement, and welfare testing. He shared honest remarks about the limitations of the tool, and he closed with the conservation applications and promises that this work has generated. So together, Hadrien and Aung gave us a grounded picture of what elephant collaring actually involves, from designing the hardware to putting the collar on the animal to understanding the analysis. So today we're so glad to be able to go deeper. So here's how we'll spend the rest of the session. The entire session is Q&A. There are no formal presentations. I'll be posing questions to Hadrien and Aung that were submitted by you all during the registration process, and I've organized these thematically so we can move efficiently through related topics. Where a question was already addressed in writing after last month's event, I may briefly note in context so newcomers aren't left behind. However, if you have questions as Aung and Hadrien are answering questions that were submitted previously, go ahead and drop them in the chat. We'll be watching and we'll try to fold audience questions in as they come up. If a question builds on what a panelist is saying in real time, that's the best kind of questions. So don't wait until the end to drop them in the chat. Drop them as you come up with them, and we'll try to integrate them in the live session. Just some housekeeping notes. Please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off to conserve bandwidth. This session is being recorded and will be shared with all registrants afterward, along with additional written follow-ups from the panelists if they're required. Again, use the chat to submit questions. We'll try to get to any questions during the session, and like last time, the panelists may be able to answer any in writing that we don't get to. Okay, I've talked long enough, so let's get into it. Let's start with the most fundamental question we received, the one that everything sort of builds on. Why collar an elephant at all? So the first question to both Hadrien and Aung is from Justin Mwaluka. Sorry if I mispronounced that. He's from Zambia, and he asked, how has elephant collaring improved conservation outcomes and reduced human-elephant conflict in local communities?
I can go first, Adrian, if you don't mind. So for me, how I think about this is our human use, land cover use, human, distribution is changing. And most of the time, we don't know how the elephants are going to respond to these changes on the landscape. So that's like the most essential question for me. It's like, how are these elephants, population and individuals responding to the stressors that we put on the landscape, whether that be, environmental or anthropogenic. So that's what's and underlines all the questions. But too specific to local communities, what been using what, like with the tools that we're using right now is trying to identify which areas are likely to be, you know, get interactive with elephants. Based on the spatial data, we can fit some models and try to make some inferences. And on the other side, right, we can talk to use these GPS information to inform our monitoring team or patrolling team, where if we have active patrols units or whatnot, whether we should focus on some of these like more hotspots area or whatnot to maybe either mitigate or prevent further escalation with the local community. So those are some of things that you can kind of make inference on, and I'll leave that kind of broad. With this answer.
So what I'll add to what Aung was mentioning there is also it helps you measure if your interventions are successful or not. So, for example, a lot of the interventions they're doing on a more African context, I don't know if they're doing a lot of this in Malaysia and Indonesia and other countries, but for example, they're changing crops that are around reserves that have elephants that maybe leave the reserves. So if you change crops from, say, citrus to chili plants, the elephants are less likely to be motivated to leave those protective areas to come and raid the crops. But once you change the crops, you have to also check, is this intervention actually successful? So that's where tracking collars, camera traps, and all of these tools come into the mix to try help assess and look if these interventions are working. For example, people are using chili fences, they're hanging beehives. From a tree perspective, in Africa, you have a lot of elephants that are fenced in smaller reserves, and these are actually destroying big iconic trees. So some NGOs like Elephants Alive, they're putting wire mesh on these trees. And this is one way to see from the GPS data, are these elephants actually still visiting these trees once the wire mesh is added and they're not killing the trees? Or you come 2 months later and the trees on the ground, everything's fallen, but you don't know if it's from a storm, if it's from other elephants, or what's actually caused that damage. Because it has been possible to identify certain, not problem animals, but animals that are more inclined to destroy trees or crop raid or things like that. So collaring those individuals helps you keep communities safe in a way. But as always is the topic around that we've been discussing, is a collar isn't going to stop that human wildlife conflict. The collar isn't going to prevent these things. It's going to inform decisions that then you need teams on the ground to go and take action on it. But it helps you measure the success of those actions. Okay.
Thanks. Just to delve a little bit deeper, because that's what we're going for today, are there instances where collars are sort of uniquely suited to address these conservation problems like human-elephant conflict, or situations where you might opt to not go for a collar and use something like camera traps instead?
Definitely. So there's depending on the situation, you need to tweak what technology you're using to pick up on those issues. Also, what type of collar. If you want to have human wildlife conflict, for example, if that's the sole reason for deploying the collar, you can have VHF beacons. You can use LoRa, for example, because you don't actually mind when the elephant's far away from human settlements. You only want to track the elephant when it's close to human settlements. So, for example, there you could have a LoRa collar, and if you're picking it up, you know it's in range of the gateway, depending on the distances, and then you can inform the people, and you can either push that elephant away or not. You can also see how the herds are reacting. So, if, for example, an intervention happens with the elephants coming into community land and you're chasing it out of drones, you can measure that success because initially an elephant's going to run, it's going to be scared. But after the 100th time you chase it away with a drone, it becomes less likely to move, and you can pick up on those behaviors and see if you need to have more aggressive interventions or if you need to change your intervention method because the animal's actually learning to accept those interventions and it's actually working around it. So I think the technology type, what data you're gathering is crucial because a lot of people want accelerometer data, they want audio loggers, they want a lot of fancy sensors on a collar. But the bottom line for human wildlife conflict, you need to know where that animal is reliably the whole time, and you want high scale data when they're close to human settlements. And when it's out in the field carrying on its life, you don't actually care about that data. You don't need that data once it's in the bigger landscape where it's not causing issues. So in situations like that, I'd advise taking a simple collar. You just get GPS data and your lifespan is going to be a lot longer. Your risk of component failure or anything going wrong on the collar is a lot less because you have a simpler device that's kind of more catering towards that problem. It's a bit the same. You can have a very fancy vehicle in the bush or while you're working in remote areas, or you could just have a very basic Land Cruiser with no added electronics or benefits. It depends on the application. The one, yes, you're going to be more comfortable, but the other one's going to get you from A to B reliably for a longer time.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Like, that's a great example, right? If you just interested in your farm, but depending on, you switch crops or whatnot, whether elephants come or reduce the crop rating and whatnot, then you don't need a collar, right? If you're just interested in your farm, you just put cameras up, you see it. If you don't detect any elephants, you're great. You're the effective treatment. But if you're using an active, like a landscape level mitigation tool, like drones or chili bombs or whatnot, or sound, whatever the tool is for human wildlife conflict or elephant conflict, if you don't monitor their movement in a finer resolution skills, you will not know how effective those are, how the elephants are. So it all ties back to what the in science term, like the treatment or your stressor is and how the elephant responds in terms of movement. So I think that's like your focus question is really important. And another example I will add is, there will be some like reintroduction events or, you translocate the elephant to, maybe like quote unquote elephant sanctuary, to whatnot. If you don't have a collar on, you don't know, elephants. And if you put a collar on, they're likely that, you can tell if they remain in the area or they just, goes right back. So without the collar, you will not know, how effective your translocation or reintroduction efforts are. So those would be some of the cases where I would consider the collar.
And on, could you also speak to maybe even your personal work with collars because you were looking at ranging patterns, just getting basic information about the elephants at the site in Myanmar where you worked. Why did you opt for collars rather than something else? And how did that information you got from the collars, how is that uniquely suited to address conservation of elephants in that area?
Yeah, I mean, for what I wanted to do is I want to look at how much. So there was like very few when I was doing this in Myanmar. There was very few information on like basic ecology of how much space they need, how they're moving, how they're interacting with, humans. So the question I posed was I had three study sites and looking at those study sites like different agriculture composition, some small scales, some large scale. So I posed the question as like, does these agriculture configuration and composition affect space use of elephants? If so, how did it affect? So that's without the collar, I don't think I can, estimate their space user, range user ranging patterns on the landscape because it's some of the areas are pretty hard to track. VHF signal is not reliable, so GPS collar was a way to go for me. So that's why I decided to do that. And in terms of conservation, I was able to identify where, the like I said, like hotspots of like high in, resource use or high intensive use areas for elephants. And on the back, like we have some fencing, working with some communities on like elephant fences and stuff. So we were able to like prioritize our focus on which villages and communities we should work on for to see that whether we're doing is effective or not.
Great, thanks. Okay, we're going to move to the hardware side because a lot of people seem to be interested and have very specific questions about that. So, Hadrien, these questions may be more geared towards your expertise, but Aung, feel free to chime in when you have something to contribute. So, one question from Musa Sabo, who's from Mozambique, asks, would some of the technologies you described last time, Hadrien, work better than satellite for collars in steep terrain near conflict zones?
Uh, yes and no. So steep terrain is very difficult, mainly because any signal is going to be blocked by steep terrain. So things like LoRa networks could work well in a situation like that, but you're going to have to put multiple gateways to make sure you cover the whole area. So there are other technologies that are available, but currently, based on the huge surface of area elephants like to use, satellite tends to be the most cost effective and best. And yeah, like I showed in the one slide where you have the canyon effect, as soon as the animal's in the canyon, you're limiting your satellite coverage, and that will affect any signal. Like Aung was saying, for his one project where the VHF wasn't great, if you have very mountainous areas, things like that, you get bounce back from the signal. So your signal can actually be as strong in front of you where you're tracking the animal and behind you. So you really have to tweak and know your equipment really well to get a positive direction and triangulate successfully to find those animals. But each landscape is unique. So I think if you provide more context on that, you can better advise the technology. So before going ahead with a project or something, I would advise to share the reserve layout, to share a bit of an idea of where the reserve is. Because simple things, for example, like if you have canyons or riverine areas and they're running north south, that's not great for iridium coverage. But if they're running east west, for example, it's actually a lot better for iridium coverage because the satellites will pass over that drainage, that canyon or that drainage line, and you have a lot higher chance of getting the signal through. So understanding the technology and knowing a bit more about the application always helps because you can then try tweak that technology to work best for you. For example, on the LoRa network as well, you could change your antennas. So instead of using a high gain antenna, like an 8 decibel gain antenna that's going to have very good range, you could use a lower gain antenna for, say, 4 decibels, which isn't going to have the same range, but it's going to have a lot better penetration on that forest. So, for example, if it's in a forest environment, you could use one of those gateways and within one of those antennas, and you're going to have better penetration. And that's why a LoRa network, you can choose to optimize distance or you can choose to optimize penetration. So all of that kind of plays into effect, but each situation is so unique. There's not a blanket satellite LoRa or this is better. It's kind of based on the situation. The more information you give the manufacturer, the more information you present, the more we have to work with to provide the best technology.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Could you explain how a user might troubleshoot what uh, sort of technology would work best? Is that something they can use knowledge about the specific site to determine, or is that something sort of trial and error has to proceed?
So definitely on the specific site, it'll help. So if you look historically, were iridium satellite elephant collars successful in that area or not, then you're going to have an idea. Okay, iridium satellite's the way to go because historically they worked really well. We actually had a very interesting case now, and Aung's actually part of the issue, and it's in Laos we provided satellite elephant collars. So previously we supplied Inmosat collars, and unfortunately, that technology has gone redundant. So they no longer make small enough modems and they decommissioned those satellites. So it's no longer an option to track elephants, where previously it was a very good option. As an upgrade, we changed to Iridium satellite collars, and Iridium has global coverage. So they should work the same everywhere. But those collars in that specific study site, we're struggling to get them to come up reliably. They've actually tried other manufacturers, and it seems to be a technology issue more than a collar issue. So now we're kind of working with them to try to see if we can rectify the issues. So we're going to try get one of the collars back to us to see if it's antenna related or if it's just iridium coverage related. And we'll try send them test units to try to see what can be done to change that? Would it be helpful for the project to change to a different satellite type? For example, you could use Argus or Global Star, which isn't as good as Iridium, but perhaps for that landscape, it might be. So it's very difficult at times. I mean, sometimes you could literally have a military base close by that could be blocking the signal, or there could be something interfering with the signal. So each landscape does tend to be unique, but overall, I'd say Iridium tends to be the most reliable. Then you also have GSM coverage, which is generally good. The problem with GSM is elephants, especially, move between national boundaries. So they'll move between countries. And you have some countries like Zimbabwe that don't have roaming agreements. You have India as well, where every network has a different cost. So you have some networks that the data costs are actually higher than Iridium. So then you're kind of weighing the differences, and it's not worth using those systems.
Great.
And I'll add one thing. Please test your collars before putting on the elephants. Like, just put it out in the field, put it, like similar vegetation for at least like a week or so, and look at what your data actually saying. If it's not, above like 90% success rate, like I would talk to, your provider, whether that be Hadrien, now you have his email, or a different collar manufacturer, right? They should respond to you and try to troubleshoot you through what they think might be possible, get that reliable signal, and that data is extremely helpful to estimate like what your position, like baseline position is when you're doing analysis later on. So having that, just like a stationary data set is super helpful before putting the calls out.
It's a good tip. Yeah, you want to make sure after you go through the pain and trouble of getting a collar on an elephant that the collar was going to work from the first place. We had a good question from Karen Carter come through the chat. Karen is located in Southern Africa, and her question is for Hadrien. She says, we were VHF tracking elephant from the air and found that we were getting a lot of false detections from near cell phone towers and electricity lines, although we were not getting any beeps. Hadrien, could you help Karen and her colleagues understand what to do in environments like this?
So environments like this, it is challenging. So VHF, generally you can pick it up extremely long range. So you can pick it up from a helicopter. If you're tracking inside the helicopter, you can pick it up about 45 kilometers, even more, from the helicopter, picking up just a VHF signal on an elephant collar. The problem you might have is if it's a specific frequency, you may struggle. So for example, we've been on operations in Namibia before. We were looking for a specific animal, and that VHF signal was interfering with the element, with something inside the helicopter. So no matter what we did, we searched, and you could just pick up interference the whole time on the mic, on the radio, and it was not working. So then we had to adapt the plan. For example, they actually dropped me off from the helicopter in the field. They would circle a little bit away. I'd pick up, try find signal, get direction, pick me up in the helicopter again, and we'd fly in that direction, and we'd triangulate the animal, and eventually found it like that, which was obviously not ideal. But there's no way of really knowing what is going to affect and interfere in an area. For example, power lines, they can resonate at different frequencies. You can have radio towers, you can have different infrastructure in the area, military stations, things like that, that have radio repeaters. All of that can interfere with the technology. So when we design the collars and we make them, we try to keep all the antennas apart inside the collar to reduce interference. We also shield all the electronics, so it also shields it from external signals actually affecting it. But there's only so much you can do. So what I would advise in a situation like that is to note down that VHF frequency. And if you are going to order collars again, we avoid that VHF frequency going forward. And also to go on foot with the vehicle. And when you deploy the collar, like what Aung says, always test the equipment in that landscape before deploying it, because that'll give you an idea. Is it the aeroplane? Is it the car? Is it interference of something on me? Perhaps you have a radio or other equipment, a UHF receiver or an old collar in the back of the car that hasn't been switched off with the magnet that could be interfering with that collar. So that's all of that can create interference. So that's a good way to kind of gauge it down the line and improve. And then, sometimes if you have interference, try avoid it, but try test the collar when you get it. After transport and courier, we've had it where collars are dropped or manhandled by the postal services and the collars break or get damaged. So test it before, and anytime you transport or move that collar, test it, leave it out, leave it open, let it run, And then once you fit it to the animal, something that's often not done, especially your satellite and GPS collars, they'll fit the collar and they won't do the fine tuning afterwards. I don't know if you've seen when people open a gate or something like that, they'll sometimes hold the remote to their chin and will actually increase the range of the remote because of your jawline and because your body acts as a ground plane to increase the range of that signal. So fitting a collar to an animal can have a similar effect. Once you fit the collar, it can affect the way the antenna is in the belting. The body and the mass of the animal can affect that signal strength. So the fine tuning is very important to do after the collar is fitted as well, because you'll often find the fine tuning before fitting the collar might be slightly out. But when you're flying in a helicopter or trying to find an animal in a huge landscape, that little bit of fine tuning is going to make the difference whether you find it or not, or it's going to add to your budget because you're going to be flying around for extra half an hour when you could have found the animal quicker. So definitely do that. Know your equipment. Go out, monitor a bit more. But if you have issues like that as well, what can help is take a video of what's happening, of the interference, the way you've set up the equipment, because sometimes it can be something simple like just holding the antenna outside the airplane or having changing the mounting brackets you're using on the airplane because that could be creating interference. Changing the coaxial cable, for example, if it's 5 meters long versus 1 meter long, it's going to improve the signal significantly. So all of these little tricks can be done, but if you take a video of the equipment, it's a lot easier to help then because it gives us a bit of a background of what could be affecting it.
Fascinating.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think it just goes to show that it's not as simple as slapping a collar on an animal and getting data back. There's so much fine-tune, really artistry that goes into this process. So we appreciate it. A question from one of our registrants, and it got cut off because Zoom only allows you to write the question a certain number of characters. So, Hadrien, maybe you can guess where this person was going. This is from Hangyo Wandono from Indonesia. They ask, we would like the AWT system to be able to share elephant position updates via WhatsApp messages for the early warning system, and that's where it's cut off. So maybe you can speak a little to that.
Okay, so most collars and manufacturers do have alerts. So I think the question here is they want all the data received only over WhatsApp. So that is something we can do as a manufacturer. But the problem is keeping in mind you can set your collar to every 10 minutes. So if every 10 minutes you're getting a WhatsApp alert coming on your phone, it becomes a bit irrelevant because false alerts tend to be ignored after the fifth or sixth time you're getting a false alert. You ignore it. And then when you have an actual alert, you don't pay attention. So that can be done if you prefer to receive the data over WhatsApp. It's definitely something we can implement and you can develop. But in general, you want to limit alerts as much as possible. So when you do get them through on a system, you know you need to take action. Unfortunately, the areas we're working in are very vast. They're big areas. They're difficult to get to. If you have to send your field rangers into the forest every time you get an alert or every time the collar takes a position, they're quickly going to grow tired of that and they're not going to take every new alert seriously. So that's why we try and limit the amount of alerts and stuff we do send. But it's definitely something. If you have a specific need to receive data in a different format or in a certain way, it's something that can easily be developed. Generally, how the systems work now, we have a personal risk detection system that analyzes the collar data in near real time. And based on certain parameters, we actually send alerts to clients. For example, a no movement that will be based on accelerometer data and a cluster. And then you can build up on that and you can look at temperature as well. So, for example, if you're getting accelerometer data not moving, you're getting a cluster of GPS points and you're getting the temperature that's constant and fluctuating almost with the ambient temperature of that area. So, very high in the day, very low in the evening. It's very likely that collar's not on the animal and the animal's died. So, things like that, then you can generate alerts where you are sure something's wrong and you need intervention. And then if you, for example, only have a cluster, it could be that elephant's just resting at a water point because it's the heat of the day or something like that. Then you can have a smaller alert. So you can have like an orange flag, but you don't send an actual alert out or WhatsApp message because you don't want to raise alarm for no reason. So yeah, it's definitely possible to do, but yeah, reach out to me and we can look at developing an alerts or WhatsApp messages in a way that you need it for your project.
Yeah, that's the kind of on the ground experience that I think a lot of people who are new to collaring might not consider. Aung, do you have any expertise to share alongside that you may envision sort of an alternative to getting a WhatsApp message every 10 minutes that may be ignored? What would you think would be most effective or more effective?
I mean, it's hard to tell with the depending on the context. Like in Indonesia, it could be pretty like hard to get to places. Um, with that, like there's two sides of the coin, right? If it's hard to get to, you want to have a lead time on like how much you need to get to. But on at the same time, like there's you don't want that frequency to be so high that it's not feasible for your team. So I was gonna ask Adrian, like, depending on the landscape, is it like possible to, fine tune those like alerts with you guys, so that it's like more specific to the programming setup, like those ambient temperature clusters are great. But maybe like adding, for example, like if an elephant cross a major road or whatnot, or heading that way, is it like a possible alert system that we can add, or is it something that we have to build as a user on the back end with our own models and stuff?
Yeah, so that's definitely possible. Any system can be adapted and tweaked to meet a specific client's needs. So we're actually trying to do that a bit more because we realize there isn't one software that's going to meet everyone's needs. And as soon as you develop a software that can meet everyone's needs, you're looking at a very complex GIS software. And there's a reason most of our clients don't use that is because either you're doing that 24/7, like I believe Aung is doing, and you're analyzing data purely like that. But from a management perspective, the people don't have the capacity to spend as much time invested in just data analysis. So we're trying to build these tools that are kind of a click of a button away where you can meet those parameters a bit easier. But we need you guys on the ground to give us that feedback, to tell us, is it working? Is it not? What you would like to change. For example, if you want to be alerted by WhatsApp every time an elephant comes within 2 kilometers of a road, that's very easy to do. We can definitely set that up. And also, for example, is there a reason for the WhatsApp alerts? My understanding of why you would want a WhatsApp alert is probably because you have limited bandwidth. So you can't log into a web application and physically see on the map where the collar is. But if you get a WhatsApp or SMS, you can walk through the forest, you get the new position coming in. Okay, great. You can type it in on a GPS. You don't really need good connectivity to be able to find that animal and keep walking behind it or keep trying to locate it. So if it's bandwidth issues, depending on the actual situation, the more information you give us, the more we have to work with, and the more we can try help and make the collar and technology assist you more with the work you're doing.
Great. Thanks so much. Along with the hardware questions, there were a number of our attendees who asked questions about costs, and costs are going to vary widely based on where you're from. So, for instance, we got similar questions from Zambia and India, and so that's going to differ not only on geographic context, but also whether you're flying a plane versus tracking on foot and all of those things. So I encourage you to look at the document we linked earlier in the chat that Hadrien and Aung spent time answering questions from the last session, because Hadrien provides some pricing. That pricing is going to range somewhere from $1,500 to $6,000 for an Iridium collar. So that, I mean, it depends on things like satellite services that you may elect to spend. But I'd like to ask both of you for our audience today to maybe run through some of the costs that are associated with collaring an elephant, especially those costs that people might not consider, like a satellite subscription cost, for instance.
Yes, I also did pretty much the breakdown that I came up with is I try to keep it in US dollars so it's constant. But I mean, obviously, depending where the manufacturer is from, they're going to give you a quote in their currency. So pretty much a GPS VHF collar, you're going to look around 2,500 to 6,000 US dollars. If it's Iridium satellite, you're looking at around 3,500 to 8,000 US dollars. Then airtime and data can vary. So it depends on how much data you're sending, but that generally goes from about 50 US dollars to about 3,000 US dollars, depending on how much data you're sending. For example, if you have an elephant collar on the Iridium network sending every 10 minutes, it's a lot of data, so you're going to pay more for that data. Or if you're sending every hour, it's going to be a lot cheaper than that. Something to keep in mind is most collars can also log data. So that's where you can kind of economize on a collar. You can send the data you need, and when you don't need data, you log it on the collar, just keeping in mind there is a risk. If you don't get the collar back, that data is lost. So there's always a kind of risk and benefits, cost, risk, benefit that you need to go through. For veterinary and drugs, this is really going to vary depending on the landscape. Sometimes you have government veterinarians, and then you don't have to pay for their hourly rates. And each vet will also have their different hourly rates. So each country is very unique and very specific. So it's almost impossible to answer that one without giving us more context of what area, which reserve, where you're working. But as Chase mentioned, looking at previous projects is probably the best way to look at what the operational costs were, and maybe also consider inflation and any issues as well. For a helicopter or aircraft, for example, in the African context, most elephants are darted from helicopters. You're looking at around 1,000 to 10,000 US dollars, but it obviously depends how long you're flying. If it's a small reserve, if your ground team went out before, found the elephant with the VHF, you're going to fly straight to it. You're going to know where it is. If you didn't do that groundwork, you're going to fly a lot longer to find the animal, and it's going to cost you more. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then you're looking at a total collaring operational cost of around 8,000 to 20,000 US dollars. Obviously, if you do more animals, it brings that cost down because you already have all the infrastructure and things in place. So if you know of other collaring operations, for example, if they're collaring lions or other animals in the area or tigers, you can try piggyback on those operations while you have the vet in place. If you're not finding elephants, you can collar a lion. You can kind of switch between the two. So while you have a big operation planned in an area, piggyback, work with other researchers, work with other people in that landscape to try bring your costs down as much as possible and share the overloads of a collaring operation. And also have a contingency plan. If a collar fails, if there's an issue of the helicopter, if cars break down, if your vet gets sick, things like that, you need to have contingency plans to have a backup for all of that. Because something simple like your vet getting sick in remote areas, you have malaria, you have a lot of things that can happen to people on the ground. And now you've got your helicopter booked, you have your whole capture team booked, you have the permits and all of the licensing there. So one team member not being there compromises the entire operation. So try plan as much for contingency as possible. And when they do pop up, which they will, you need to adapt, think on your feet, and come up with solutions as quickly as possible.
Very good point. Aung, do you have anything else to contribute?
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that is in, Southeast Asia where I mainly worked, we do a lot of ground guarding, so that kind of is hard to scale, because, there could be like, a couple of days where we get an elephant, but it could take a month to get one herd, depending on where you are and how they're acting about on the landscape. So budgeting for that is pretty hard. So like one of the ways that we were doing is like instead of paying for time, we were like, okay, we want this, 5 elephants for this field season. What would that be? So like talking with your vets and like the field team, if that's a feasible strategy, I would like try to start conversation around that. But like usually it averages about to, minus the collar, about 3,000 to $5,000 of like per elephant of fuel costs. So you should budget for that. So just, something to consider.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and for those of you interested in maybe applying for IEF conservation funds to collar an elephant, all of this information is things we evaluate in your proposal, just making sure applicants are aware of all of the miscellaneous costs involved in collaring an elephant, and those applicants demonstrating evidence that they've talked with other projects if they haven't collared elephants themselves before, or they have knowledgeable people on their team who can inform that, because the planning is paramount, right? On sort of piggybacking off of that, we had some questions about study design, and you mentioned it might take a day to find one elephant to collar. It might take a few days to find a herd of elephants. What sort these questions have to deal with how to choose which elephants to collar and how many are enough. So first question, John Tugume from Uganda asks, in a wide elephant rangeland, is it scientifically suitable to collar half of the population of African elephants? And I'm not sure how big a population of African elephants is at that site.
So I think a couple months ago, Ignis Silver, I think, from Justin Calabrese group, she published a good paper. I think it was in Ecology and Evolution, about do you have enough or right size of sample for your population infant size? So she does a bunch of simulation and whatnot, usually half should be enough depending on what trying to see, but they could be different herds. How big your landscape is also a consideration. Like, are you just like concentrating half? Like, is it a one big, group of sub population on the landscape and you're not working on the rest, like a half of the landscape or whatnot. So it's a very tricky question and a broad one. But what I would say is, calling elephant is very expensive. So let's say if you're interested in, defining a corridor or a connectivity issue, like, a major road coming and you're trying to define which, this is an example, right? Like which part of the road you should put in, those elephant crossings or whatnot, then you probably focus on that area of landscape. And every year, after every season, right, you could do some simulation where, depending on the metric, if you start adding, whole bag, what you call her, so start with like two individuals, do your analysis, and then if you add one more, does that variance component changes of for your monitoring metric? If that if it changes a lot, then you might need more samples. So keep adding those, and once that variance of the monitoring of metric stables out, essentially what that paper is saying is like then you will have enough sample to make an inference on the population level. So I would say like you need to evaluate what you have. We got to start somewhere, right? Start with five, add more, see how what your inference on the system changes once you start adding more individuals. If it starts to change, then you probably don't understand enough or don't have enough sample in your study yet. So if you have specific context on like what the questions are, I'll be able to answer more and you know provide you more details or which paper to go. But I would check out that paper. It's a pretty well written, broad, and I would trust what those guys are saying. Pretty smart.
Great.
Yeah.
We also had a question from one of our registrants, Simran Dakal from Nepal, which sort of also dovetails off a question that was answered by you both from last session. And it might help this person from Uganda because there's ways you can economize getting information from a lot of elephants while only collaring a single elephant, like a matriarch. Hadrien pointed to that in his written response in the document we linked. So, what are the challenges, though, in collaring female adult elephants that are in a herd?
I I've done that, and I can share a story where I spent about 3-4 hours up in a tree because we try to dart a female and the herd won't split. Sound didn't work, anything didn't work, so we had to shot a reversal and just wait it out, and it wasn't possible. So that's a pretty big consideration. And like I was darting on foot, so like there's no way we can drive it with a vehicle. We were just making sure the elephant doesn't, die on our watch. So that's yeah, definitely a concern. And if they don't want to move, there's nothing you can do about it. So there's that.
Yeah. Hadrian, did you want to expand upon the answer you provided in written form?
Yeah, so I mean that's one of the reasons in Africa where you have a more open landscape. We only dart generally with helicopters because if you are darting a breeding herd, they'll generally not want to leave the matriarch alone. So the helicopter allows you to drive off the rest of the herd far enough that you can have time to quickly deploy the collar, take samples, take measurements, and then get that animal awake and away as soon as possible. Things also to consider is the structure. So if that matriarch has a young calf, then you might not be able to collar the matriarch. So you could look for the next biggest dominant, next more dominant female, and you could try put the collar on her instead. So sometimes you can plan, okay, cool, we have 10 herds in our reserve. We want to put 10 collars on all the matriarchs. And unfortunately, at the time, if a few of them have calves, you need to adapt your plan and change. So understanding those animals before the time, if you can, by building identification kits, looking at ear patterns, looking at scars, or anything that is identifiable feature on the animal can help, because you can try to target those individuals when collaring. But sometimes it's not possible and you have to adapt the plan. Also, the safety of the animal should be a top priority, but also you have a team around you, you have people on the ground. So generally, people also carry a weapon as well. So you'll have a high caliber rifle or something like that. If something does go wrong, you can intervene and you can try uh, alleviate the situation if possible. But I mean, anything can go wrong. So it's best to plan for every situation. So that's why having helicopters, having vehicles. But as Aung says, a lot of these situations, you're walking on foot in dense vegetation. Having small teams, not with a lot of paying tourists or something with you, can also help, because you can climb trees a lot more efficiently. You can run away and you don't have to worry about other people getting injured or something like that. So the question was asked, do community members, for example, come with on collarings? It's great to do that if the environment allows, but the problem is there's so many unknowns. Sometimes it's possible to take people, and sometimes I've been on collarings in very easy landscapes, open savanna area with helicopters and ground teams and stuff like that, and you can just have one unknown that pops up and it changes the whole dynamic. You can, for example, have a buffalo bull in a thicket next to you that gets startled while the elephant's down, the rest of the herd's moved off, and all of a sudden you have a very dangerous situation on the ground, because you have everyone on the ground around the elephant, a buffalo popping out of the shrubbery, and you need to adapt and keep people safe, one, because that is your responsibility, and also try to keep the animals safe, because that's as well your responsibility. Animals can also be aggressive to one another. So there's been situations where elephants are darted and the rest of the herd will actually attack that individual. So they'll go and try tusk that animal. So there've actually been fatalities like that of elephants being darted. And it's not because the aggression is always towards the individual. It's because they see the behavior has changed and they'll try to pick the elephant up and try and move it along, get it away from danger. And in doing that, they can tusk it and they can actually cause a fatality on that animal. So there's a lot of things to consider. And this also boils down, if you do plan something like this, try get an experienced team. The only thing that can prepare you for situations like that is experience. And even the most experienced guys that I know in the field doing this on a very regular basis, they're still learning every day. So experience pays off, and try ask around, learn from other people, learn from the experiences, and try have those people as part of your team when collaring.
Great point. I think what you said earlier about knowing your animals before it's time to dart them is obviously very important. And at IEF, when we're funding collaring operations, we want evidence that the team has not only experience collaring an elephant, but experience at that site and knowing which elephants are most appropriate to engage with collaring. So let's move on, because Hadrien led us that way into field operations and process, what actually happens on the day. There were several registrants that specifically asked us to walk through the process from DART to data. So Daniel Grove from Zambia and Mukti Roy from India both asked about the collaring process itself. What does the process actually look like, both on the human and the elephant side? And this differs, of course, site to site, especially between Africa and Asia, but it might be helpful to just lay it out.
Yes, sir. I can give a brief layout of pretty much what the process is, and I think that is included in my presentation as well, just the basic structure. And then obviously on each landscape, it's going to be unique. If you're darting from a helicopter, if you're darting from the ground, what your reason for collaring is, depending what parties are involved. If you have a lot of researchers, for example, if you're looking at the fertility of an elephant, if you're looking at things like this, and you have a whole team of university students there busy taking samples, it's going to vary what the process is. But in general, you have your planning. So that'll be your initial structure of why you're collaring, what's the reason for collaring, what permits and stuff you need. So it'll be planning, permits, team briefing. You locate the elephant, you do the darting, the immobilization and monitoring, collar fitting, the reversal of the drug to wake up the animal, recovery monitoring, and then data confirmation. So then after you'll get your data coming in. So that's a very brief summary of what the process will look like. But each landscape would be unique. If you want to have a better understanding of that, feel free to reach out to myself or Aung or anyone at the IEF, because we can provide you. There's a lot of resources online. There's videos on YouTube that show how collars are deployed and things like that. And it helps looking at these, because then you get to see firsthand what the experience is. And also, if you are planning to do a collaring, there's a lot of people deploying collars. Reach out to people. Maybe you can attend a collaring with them in that landscape. If you're in India or if you're in Africa, depending, or in Zambia or wherever you're calling from, go on a collaring with a team that's busy doing it. Then you can see what that learning curve is firsthand and you can experience. Guys are very open to sharing information and helping one another. So I think reach out to the community. People won't be against it. There's a lot of collars being deployed. There's a lot of animals being immobilized fairly regularly. Try to be part of that process before doing it alone yourself.
Yeah, I'll add a few things to that. If you're, calling a national park, you'll have national park staff and whatnot. All those permits sorted out. But if you're like calling near like a village intersection where it's like outside the national park with near the local communities, it's just talk to them before, like the day before, let them know that you'll be going in. Because just tell them like a general area, like where you are, like don't say exact locations or whatnot, but so that they're aware, like most of the communities in Southeast Asia, right? They'll go into the forest, gets whatnot, like their daily coal or whatever they're doing, so that they can be aware of like there's gonna be elephant running or whatnot in the area. So just make sure they're aware of what you're doing, explain to them, talk to them, and see get the local community involved in that way. In terms of like you're briefing your team, just have the experienced team really help. But if you have a newer member, just make sure what they know their role is, and what the plan is when there's oops happens, which you will. So like have them like, okay, just follow this guy if something goes wrong. Maybe that will be a head vet or a team lead or whatnot. So make sure like your newer member in the team knows what they're doing, and once the elephant is down, what they're supposed to do. And there's a lot of like monitoring process that your vet should know, your team should know, and you should have a plan on what you're monitoring, how you're fitting, recording time. So most of the newer members, they would probably do data recording and whatnot. So like make sure those roles are defined. And post monitoring is pretty important. It shouldn't just be that day. It should be, a week. So you should have budgeted amount for like, if the data are receiving, if not, what are you gonna do? Do you have budget to like guard it again and remove the collar? What's your plan? So like having those backup plans, it's very important when you're considering putting collar on an elephant.
Great, thanks. There was one question from Rakesh Kalva from India asking about which drugs may be used to knock down an elephant. Granted, neither of you are vets, and all vets have their own preferences, but do either of you want to share what you've used before, what you think is most prevalent in the field?
I consult your vet. Like Chase said, I am not a registered vet, so don't sue me. But we have to use entorpin for if the elephant's going down. Some vet use standing sedation, some mix. So I'm not going to give an exact dosage on what you should use in your field setting, but most of the community is now moving towards a standing sedation if your vet's comfortable doing it. So I would talk to an experienced vet. There's great teams across Southeast Asia, Malaysia. Yeah, consult with those, but those are the two main options, right? If you're gonna go like on the side, that's like a most extreme case, probably safer for people, but not as safe for an elephant. But if you're having experiencing, I would push you guys towards like standing sedation. It's a lot easier to fit a collar on. If you know what you're doing, it's safe for humans too, and safer for elephants. So.
Do you have anything to add, or
Yeah, I won't share doses or what drugs, but there's a very good book which can be used as a resource by Dr. Mike Koch and Dr. Richard Burrows. And their book's called The Physical Chemical Restraint of African Animals. And in that book, they pretty much go through all the African species and they explain the different capture methods, what drug doses have been used before, and what they would recommend. But as Aung pointed out there, every situation is unique. So depending on whether, if the animals were stressed before, can you get those drugs available in your country? Some countries don't allow those drugs in, so you have to adapt your plan based on that. So really look at what situation it is and consult your local vets in-house in the country and speak to other people that have immobilized animals before. Ideally, only vets should be doing this or provide that information. But that book is a very good resource. I don't have the link to it now, but I'll share it with you after this, Chase, and you can maybe share the link to that book because I think it's a very good resource to get a very good understanding of what the process is like. And as Aung pointed out, it's very important for all the parties involved in the collaring operation to understand the individual roles as well, because then you don't get in the way of one another while you're moving. An elephant's great because it's very big. So usually a lot of people can fit around it. So if there's a collaring, you generally can take tail hair samples while someone's working on the trunks or administering blood or taking samples or whatnot. So you have a lot of space, but you don't want to get in the way of one another or, for example, trip over the animal's legs or someone standing on the trunk and then he can't breathe. You want to kind of leave the airways open and allow enough space for the vet to monitor this easily. But the drug dose, yeah, there's many different ones that people use and it depends on the situation. So better to consult with a vet on that.
Yes.
But please have a Narcan on your team for all the people that are in the collaring process. Like have one in the pocket because you don't want to get dosed by any of these drugs that we put in elephants.
Good point. Karen Carter in the chat also provides some details about the veterinarian she's worked with, what their preferences is. That said, as all of us has emphasized, this is the job of a vet. None of us are vets, and so a vet should definitely be part of your team, both in the planning process and on the ground. Again, speaking to the point that there should be experience on the team collaring. The only way to learn how to collar is by following along with an experienced team themselves. You can't walk in blind. So that is critically important. We're also looking for a link to the book that Hadrien mentioned, and we'll try to put it in the chat before the session concludes. But if we can't find it, we'll send it along with the materials following up after this event. Okay, let's move on to welfare. So welfare came up more from the registrants this round than we did last month. I think probably because of the discussion that was fostered last month. And it also reflects sort of the seriousness that people are bringing to this work and the honest questions people have had about the trade-offs. So let's start with a question from Jackson Matitu from Tanzania. He asks, is there any negative ecological and morphological impact on elephant populations that can result from collaring?
If you're putting the collar on, the right way, meaning if it's not like choking the animal or if it's too loose, it can scrape the neck. Then physiologically, like they don't mind at all. Like 40 pounds for an elephant is nothing. And I haven't seen any negative effects on movement patterns or whatnot. Collar versus non-collar animal. So I'll leave that kind of open-ended, but that's would be my initial answer.
Yes, I agree with Aung. So it's all boils down to how the collars are fitted, and that'll boil down. You'll see straight away if the animal's behaving funny after that. So that's where post monitoring is also important. For example, if the collar's twisted, if the elephant's lying on its side and you're fitting the collar, it can be difficult to not have a twist in the belt when you pull it underneath the animal. So sometimes you can by accident fit a collar and the belting can be twisted, things like that. If it's causing discomfort to the animal, you'll straight away see he'll be pulling on it. They'll often smell the collar with the trunk a bit and carry on like that, but you'll straight away see if it's causing real discomfort, and then you might need to intervene. Also, animals react differently to the drug doses. So, for example, if you're collaring very old bulls, which is often done because people want to keep monitoring on big tuskers because they are priority species for tourism and they're often selected for poaching, Collaring big bulls is very difficult because they're large, they're older, they're a bit more fragile, so they don't recuperate as well as younger individuals from the drug doses. So just keep in mind that the animals you select, the risk you're taking in putting the collar, and any immobilization, like a human going for anesthesia or anything like that, there's always a risk involved. So your reason for collaring an intervention should always outweigh that risk, and you should never do any intervention without good cause. Other things that can go wrong is obviously while chasing the animal, darting it, animals can be injured, things like that, while they're running through thickets. If there's cliffs or the topography doesn't allow, for example, if you're darting an elephant and it's running through a swampy area where there's deep water, call off the darting, don't dart that animal, move off, select another individual where it's safer. Because if the animals go down in water, things like that, it can be very difficult because you'll have to keep the trunk above water. You'll have to reverse the drug almost immediately. And if you did need to fit a collar or do anything else, it's almost impossible to do in that time frame. So the balance is there, and just to check and make the correct decisions on the ground. And that's once again where experience comes in. So there's always a risk. Any intervention of animal, there's a risk to the elephant, there's a risk to the people on the ground, there's a risk to, yeah. So definitely weigh that risk carefully and make the right decisions if you can when you're on the ground. And don't be scared to call off for collaring as well. I think sometimes people have a lot of money and time invested in a situation. If the situation isn't correct, there's too much risk involved, call it off, say we're stopping today, we'll carry on tomorrow, we'll regroup, we'll rethink what we're doing and how we're doing it, and call it off, do it again tomorrow. And if anything's at risk, rather call off an operation for another day.
Good point. So if even if the collaring operation seems to go well, what sort of problems have you encountered with the collared animal because of the collared itself after, like, sometime after the elephant has been collared? And are there any possible solutions to deal with those issues later?
Yeah, so with collars, the main issues we see is either mud or the collar twisting, and then the collar doesn't work. So generally, you can wait a couple of days and the mud will dry or fall off and it rectifies itself. If it doesn't rectify itself, share photos of the manufacturer so we can kind of look and advise case by case. Sometimes, if collars twist, they can cut into the animal's side, and that can irritate the animal and it can become dangerous. So then, human intervention is necessary. You might have to re-immobilize that animal, change the fitment of the collar, either usually tighter, you need to fit the collar and see if that works. Sometimes it's not possible to recollar that individual. If there's an injury or something like that, then you remove the collar and unfortunately you have to pick another study animal. So those are generally the issues you see. Sometimes when you're mobilizing animals, depending on the drug doses, the stress, the heat, things like that, the animals can wake up before everyone's finished on the ground. So you can have an animal suddenly pop up and wake up and start running around, and that can create a bit of chaos and so on. So just be cautious that can happen. Know which direction you're going before the time while the animal's down. Know where the vehicles are so that everyone doesn't scatter in the bushes around the elephant and the elephant doesn't have a clear path to get away from people. Generally, when they wake up, they want to leave and get away from humans as quick as possible. So try have everyone sitting on the one side with a clear exit strategy if that animal does wake up earlier, so you don't have people scattering all around in different directions. What else can go wrong? I mean, there's a lot that can go wrong, but if everything's planned for and you've taken the correct precautions and you're working with an experienced team, the risk is low. I mean, people are collaring a lot of animals out there, and there's not a lot that is going wrong because people are generally planning it, like Chase says, before giving funding, before taking that next step with anything. You're trying to make sure that everything is in order and you've kind of considered all the options that can go wrong, and you've kind of made a contingency plan for that.
Good point. Karen Carter also mentioned in the chat that they've seen abscesses develop a few years under the collar because of dried mud, but they only discover those abscesses when they're removing the collar a few years later. Have either of you observed or heard of any behavioral differences in collared elephants versus uncollared elephants? Do you think there's any sort of more subtle effects that may occur because that elephant is collared?
The only thing I notice, this is like only few individuals. They're the second, changing the collar or removing the collar because it stopped working once it started. There's a couple of elephants that in the population that I worked in, they're more likely to run away from us when we're trying to dart them second time. So that's the only like behavior that I notice. Outside of that, is it's like a handling effect from like any other animal, right? Chase happy, case trap happy or trap shy. Those behavior can exist, but that I haven't encountered any.
Yeah, from my side, the only things I'm aware of is there has been records for other studies, but not elephant related, where they saw that predation levels were higher on ungulates that had collars than on individuals that weren't collared. So one of the reasons there is that the predators were seeing the collar on the animals and were selecting them out from the group because they look different. So it'll almost be like an injured animal. So that was one thing that stick out on elephants. I'm not aware of anything like that, but some situations we have seen is there was an elephant bull on a fenced-in reserve near Pretoria in South Africa, and he actually learned to break the collars off. So he actually went to power lines, and he would force the collar under the power lines, which was steel cables, and he would actually saw the collars off by moving back and forth. So this was learned behavior. He learned how to do that. And unfortunately, he was a problem animal. And it was very difficult to recollar him because he learned behavior. So elephants are extremely intelligent. So they will pick up on any small differences like that. The other time I've seen where it wasn't really collar related, it was more contraceptive related. It was a fenced in reserve in South Africa. And they were contracepting all the cows on the reserve. They had about 100, I think they're sitting around 120 elephants or something like that, and they would contracept all the females every 2 years. And as soon as you go up to go dart all the females, the herds, no matter where they were from the collar data, you could actually see they would start running to the sand forest vegetation that was there to get into the thickets where they couldn't be darted. So the elephants had learned as soon as that collar comes, as soon as they hear the helicopter, they would leave the grassy floodplains and they would run straight to the sand forest. So in order to contracept them, you would have to plan the operation quite carefully for the wet season when they were more on the open plains. So seasonality helped to try combat that. And the animals would all run straight to the sand forest. You also had a certain time frame. You had about an hour to try dart as many of the animals as possible. And if you weren't successful, you wait a week or two until things calm down and then you could try again. So that was a logistical challenge. But as Aung says, if you recollar the same individuals repeatedly, they will learn that behavior and they will avoid people and they will become a bit more intelligent on that, like standing under trees, moving in positions where it's difficult to dart. But I'd say that's more the noise of the helicopter and the operation that's affecting them. The actual collar itself, I don't think it's affected them. Like I said, they'll smell the collar, they'll feel it a bit, but they quickly become accustomed to it. A bit like you, if you have a new watch or something like that, a new pair of shoes, the first couple of weeks, it'll irritate you a bit. Like Karen was saying, you can maybe get blisters or abscesses on the neck. But after a while, we've never seen those persist. They generally heal under the collar and then it's fine. And most of the damage we've seen like that from abscesses, it's all superficial. So if you're removing the collar and you see it, we clean it. But we've never seen an issue that's kind of persistent with that.
Yeah, I think that just points to the importance of just continued monitoring during the collar's life. It's not the sort of thing where you just put the collar on and come back when it's time to take the collar off. It's important for ground truthing the data, but it's also important that you know your population and know the impact that collaring is having. Speaking of the collar's lifespan, a few questions about maintenance malfunctions and collar reuse. So Emmanuel Kobe Wanso from Cameroon asked, if an elephant's collar malfunctions and we no longer receive GPS coordinates, how should we return to the tagged elephants, especially if you don't know where it is?
So that's a very tricky one, obviously. The best thing to do is to look at the historic data and look at the seasonality. So generally elephants will utilize a landscape or have a home range. So you can look at that and you can look at the seasonality. So you look at the same season a few years back if you have data and you can start your search from that area. I would always advise that all of the collars we make always have VHF. So VHF is an extremely reliable backup. It uses next to no power. So, for example, on a D-cell battery, you're going to get 10-year lifespan, which will generally outlast any collars, belting, or GPS or satellite functionality. And I would advise to always, no matter what technology you're using, have a VHF in the collar as a bare minimum. This is a very reliable way to remove the collar or find the animal should anything go wrong. And if VHF can send through mud, rain, water, any conditions, you can pick it up. So although if it's a difficult terrain, it might be difficult to find, like what Karen was experiencing with interference, things like that. But ultimately, if you spend enough time, you will find the animal. You just need to adapt where it is. If it moves to a different area where there's perhaps not interference, then you'll pick it up. But at least it gives you multiple chances to try to find that animal, remove the collar, or monitor it if you need to.
Good.
Okay.
Sergey Alexis Kamgang from Cameroon, also from Cameroon, asked, once the collar reaches the end of its operational life and is successfully recovered, can it be reprogrammed and redeployed on another elephant?
Yeah, so if the collar lifespan's still good, you can. Generally, you just need to be cautious of obviously elephants have different neck sizes. So if you're removing a collar from a big bull and you want to deploy it on a cow, it's usually possible because the belting will still have the right size. If you're removing it from a cow and want to fill it to a bull, most manufacturers leave a bit of extra strapping on the collar. You can keep that strapping when you fit the collar, and then you can extend the belting with plates and clips. We can also send extra plates and clips if you need it. You can extend the collar belting to fit a different individual. And you can definitely, we've had some collars that have been deployed 3-4 times on different individuals, depending on what the reason for collaring is. So you can definitely redeploy a collar, especially the newer collars that lifespan's really good. If the batteries are good and everything's still working, you can certainly redeploy it, correct?
Great. One question we got from Fitria Edhi from Indonesia. They asked about procedures to be taken for maintaining the units before and after deployment, but I assume that's going to uh, accompany any collar, including Hadrien's company, AWT. As they provide them, they'll provide guidance about how to maintain the collar. And as Hadrien just explained, how the potential for redeploying the collar after its lifespan on an animal. So just make sure you're organizing that with whatever supplier you choose to use. We have a few questions about data analysis. Unfortunately, a few of them got cut off to where we would have difficulty understanding where the question was going. So please feel free to email us at IEF or one of the speakers for those specific questions. But Aung, one of the questions you wrote a response to, I think would be good to talk about with this group. You refer to the paper in the journal you discussed at the beginning of the session, but how can GPS movement data be integrated with habitat use data to identify priority ecological corridors?
Priority ecological corridors. So I would specify that question by like corridor is species specific. Um, and with elephants, there's other species that could be used, but like I would define what you mean, like if it's an elephant corridor or a particular type of corridor. So like be specific about that. But there's a lot of paper and literature. There's no one right way to do it. But if you have enough sample, this always comes back, right? Like, but let's say, for example, one of the landscape, like in Kenya, Samburu, like George Schroedermeyer, which most of you probably know, he's been coloring since, like the 90s, like the early 2000s, they have like hundreds of elephants, not even like thousands of elephants on the landscape. They know every individual by name. When you have that much data, it doesn't really make sense to just put in a model and try to like simulate out, which most of the connectivity modeling do. Um, you can just use a GPS data, right? Just plot it out, overlay with the grid, see which, season, which grid, which landscape are getting used as a corridor. You can define those from empirical data, but most of us doesn't have that luxury in doing so. So that's why we have to rely on model. So there is like you can build resistant surfaces, meaning elephants some areas where elephants are less likely to move through and use those layer in a simulation based, like, surface or whatever simulation that you would like to do. I since it's like very broad, like I feel free to like chat with me or talk to whoever is doing the work in your organization. But like you will have to decide which model is appropriate for your modeling framework or your capacity. But then you can get those like simulation based corridor, like infer corridors on the landscape, and you can do some scenario planning or whatnot based on those like model outputs. But I would say every model is wrong, but some are useful. So make sure your models are useful. So that means, validate your data with empirical data. That's like GPS data. So make sure those make sense, and use your local knowledge on the landscape. So if that makes sense, both like logistically and ecologically on the landscape. So those are some of the things that I would consider when doing this sort of analysis and conservation work.
Great. And a follow-up question to that just came through the chat from Josiah Aduko, who asks, how do you handle transboundary migratory groups, especially where the migratory distances and cycles are longer? I assume this is one of the benefits of using a collar is that you can follow elephants no matter the geographic barrier they cross. But do you want to speak to anything else, either Aung or Hadrien?
I think this is a great tool or example to demonstrate and get different stakeholders together. Usually, like they would know, but like they're like don't really care. But like with this like hard evidence, right? They kind of are like most of the countries are part of like the IUCN network and whatnot, so they're kind of required to act on it, or they have some incentive to act on this. And giving that data in your hand as a conservation organization, it's not most of the time useful. And having those discussion moving forward, working with different governments. But yeah, it's a yeah, like Adrian said, like they don't know which, they don't care. Like elephants don't care, either in, Kenya or whatever. So they'll go where they want to go.
Great. We're reaching the end of our time, so please get in any last questions you have in the chat. We just have time for one or two more. But Hadrian, there was one question from the written material I think would be good to share with this group, given that we've shared a lot of the breadth of information you have to consider when you're um, embarking on a collaring operation, and some of the newer folks to collaring may be sort of intimidated by that. Can you speak to sort of the technical support and collaboration that Africa Wildlife Tracking provides with customers who purchase collars from you?
Yes, so the main support we give, so we are available obviously online, so you can send us WhatsApps, you can send emails. So generally we send a little document with information on the collar, how to fit it, with all the resources you need for that collaring. Most of the clients we have are long-term clients, so they've been ordering collars from us for the last 20, 30 years. And that also helps because as the years come past, the technology changes, we keep them informed. But we're always available. So if anyone has any questions or issues or questions about software, collars, anything like that, we can always provide information for them. And generally, most of the support we provide is over email. So most of this is people email us the company support or whatnot, depending on their needs, and we'll allocate that accordingly. And we also do WhatsApp support. So most of our clients have my WhatsApp number, and they'll just reach out directly if they need help. And that's also how we help people in urgent situations, because often the collaring will be on a Sunday at 2 o'clock in the morning or whatnot, and you need something urgently. Then we try and make ourselves available as often as possible. Sometimes, obviously, due to time zones, we might not be, but we'll always try to respond to you as soon as possible.
Great. It seems like a lot of people use your collars, and so I'm sure that goes along with the level of support you provide. So thank you again for that service. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming through, so I think we'll start to wrap up. Before we close, I just want to thank both of you again. I'll speak on behalf of the IEF team that we are so appreciative for the time you've given our community to talk about these topics. Collaring is a unique and indispensable tool in a lot of situations that comes with a lot of challenges, especially those who are new to it. So we really appreciate you um, giving us just a glimpse into what it may be like. Of course, sessions like this do not replace practical hands-on experience. So as both of our speakers emphasize, make sure you're including those folks, whether they're on your team or you have to consult outside of your team, make sure those skills and experience are represented during the planning and execution process. To our attendees, thank you again for the thoughtful comments and questions you've left, for staying engaged, and for the work you're doing on behalf of elephants around the world. The reach of this conversation includes practitioners from across Africa and Asia, joined by colleagues from elsewhere around the world. All of that collaboration reflects why this work truly matters. So, some final housekeeping. Remember that a recording of today's session will be shared with all registrants in the coming days, so make sure to check your email for that. It looks like we got to all of the questions, but if you have any further questions, feel free to send them to IEF and we can distribute them to our panelists. They've been so generous with their time. I hope they don't mind answering just a few more through text, but don't be afraid to send them our way. I wanted to make sure you all were aware of some upcoming dates. August 7th is the deadline for the 2027 IEF Conservation Grant. You can access that grant by going to elephantconservation.org and a little pop-up window will show up. And so make sure you're aware of that deadline and you leave ample time to complete the online form, giving time for any technical issues to iron themselves out before that deadline. Otherwise, on August 20th, we have a conservation chat that's open to the public. That chat will be with Jay Crafter from Working Dogs for Conservation, and that will happen at 9 a.m. Pacific or 11 a.m. Central. You can again check IEF's website or our social media for links to that conversation. To stay connected with IEF's work, including the grant program, conservation chats, and everything else we're doing, please visit our website or follow us on social media. We just released our annual report from last year full of the projects we supported. So if you're looking for inspiration for those conservation grants, that's a good place to start. On behalf of myself, Sarah, Debbie, and the rest of our IEF team, thank you all once again. Be safe wherever you are, and we look forward to seeing you at the next IEF workshop. Have a good day, everyone.